My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problem, just exactly the same conflict.
It is arguably one of the most famous photos of World War II. The Big Three, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, sitting in front of their advisors at the February 1945 Yalta Conference. Churchill, the British Prime Minister, resembles so many of the English bulldogs named after him over the past 75 years. Stalin, the Soviet premier, looks every bit the cold, hard, totalitarian in his military uniform and matching hat. U.S. President Roosevelt, the man whose voice you hear at the start of our podcast theme tune, is sandwiched between them, looking tired and frail in contrast. Since 1945, this photo, depicting both the closing days of World War II and the opening days of the Cold War, has epitomized the Yalta Conference. But it is incomplete, and, while undoubtedly a powerful image of Allied unity, only tells a portion of the story. Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. My name is Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. In her new book, The Daughters of Yalta, The Churchills, Roosevelts and Harrimans, A Story of Love and War, Catherine Katz uses troves of previously unstudied sources to paint a picture of Yalta that is much more personal, emotional, and intimate than anything that has come before it, and, in many ways, both similar to and starkly different from the idea of Yalta the Big Three photo conjures in our minds. My colleague, Alistair Somerville, sat down with Catherine a few weeks ago to discuss her new book. There are few, if any, historical events with a historiography as debated as that of Yalta. Early histories of the conference during the early Cold War years painted FDR as an utter failure, treasonous even, who handed Eastern Europe to the Soviets on a silver platter. As diplomatic historian Mark A. Stoller writes, the political uproar over Yalta resulted in the early publication in 1955 of a special volume of documents from the conference within the State Department's Foreign Relations series. As someone who began their government career in the State Department's Office of the Historian working on the Foreign Relations series, I can tell you that that was a big deal. Later, revisionist studies in the 60s and 70s provided a more nuanced reading that defended FDR and his actions in the midst of a global conflict as he worked to first and foremost win the war and keep the Grand Alliance intact. The pendulum swung back again in the 1980s, once again throwing more of the blame on FDR. In many ways, the historiography of Yalta is also a window into different eras' domestic American attitudes and those of the historians who wrote about the war as the decades went on. What is missing from all of these studies is anything that comes close to the intimacy and approach of Catherine Katz's new book. As you'll hear in Alistair's discussion with her, the cast of characters, including in many ways the palace itself, is fascinating, and the book describes a side of the conference as yet unknown to a wider audience. Importantly, though, the book tells a new and fresh side of the conference while also bringing to bear the world-altering importance of what transpired on the shores of the Black Sea. Let's listen to the conversation.
Catherine Katz, thank you so much for joining the Diplomatic Immunity podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This is definitely the best named podcast out there, so it's a lot of fun to be here. Thank you.
So set the scene for us. It's Yalta, 1945, 75 years ago. The war in Europe is almost over, and there's a gathering of the Allied powers attempting to shape the peace after the defeat of Nazi Germany. So tell us, where are we at the start of this book?
Yes, so we are at the point in the war where the war in Europe is not quite over, but it is beginning to look like peace will be coming in Europe sometime in the spring. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended. The race is now on to see who will liberate Berlin. In the Pacific, things are not quite as far along. The Americans don't yet know if the atomic bomb will work. There's looking at the potential for a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands. So we are at the point where they're thinking about, how to wrap up the war in Europe. and also how to make some progress in the Pacific and FDR's view in hopes of minimizing the American casualties in doing so.
And I really loved the descriptions that you used as you set the scene for the conference itself. You have some maps at the beginning that kind of set out the lay of the land, but then at the very beginning of the book, you really get into kind of what does this all look like? What is the scene that the three daughters find? What is the scene that the statesmen who are going to play the leading roles in this conference? What do they find when they arrive here on the Black Sea?
Yes, Levadia Palace, where they're having the conference, and Yalta, it's almost like a character in its own right in the story. And I think people don't realize what it took to get there and just how far and how remote and how dangerous it was. Churchill has to fly from London first to Malta, where he rendezvous with FDR, who's been traveling by ship for more than a week from Washington, D.C., crossing the Atlantic Ocean, where they're still seeing enemy U-boats. And then once they are in Malta, they have to then fly onto the Crimea, which of course has been in the news a lot the last number of years. And they have to fly over enemy occupied territory where they're still being shot at by enemy anti-aircraft units. One of the advanced planes does take some fire. They're flying at very low altitude and unpressurized planes. And it's just incredible to think that anybody allowing this today for the principles of, these most important figures in the world. And so once they arrive in the Crimea, they land at this airfield, which has been put together kind of haphazardly just to make it possible to land. The runway's way too short. Then they have to drive 6 hours over these battle-scarred roads, being guarded by Soviet soldiers, many of whom don't even have weapons. And they finally arrive at Levadia Palace, which had been the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, really kind of a family retreat on the shore, which is very much like the Mediterranean. A number of the noble families of the Russian Empire had homes there. It's kind of called the Romanov route. And it's this really beautiful place, but there's something a bit haunting about the Black Sea itself and about the history of Levadia Palace. Of course, the Romanov family was brutally murdered during the Russian Revolution. And after that, the Soviets took over this palace and used it as a sanitarium and rest home for Soviet workers. And then during the war, the Nazis invaded the Crimea and used Levadia as their Crimean headquarters. And the Soviets have now pushed them out. But when the Nazis left, they stripped the palace of absolutely everything: the furniture, the art, the china, even down to the doorknobs. Literally, there's nothing left in this shell of former glories. So the Soviets have 3 weeks from the time when they agree where they're going to meet to the time the conference is taking place, and they have to restock everything. So they take the contents of some of the luxurious hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, and put it on trains and send it 1,000 miles south to the Crimea, where they frantically restock everything. But they even, are still missing things like ashtrays and coat hangers, just the mundane aspects of everyday life, which have to be requisitioned out of the homes of the local people whose lives have been completely devastated by the fighting there. And so it's very much this contrast between the extreme splendor and graciousness of the Soviets and their hosting, and take great pride in how they're hosting this, but then also just the utter wreckage everywhere else. And so it is this very palpable contrast, which stands out to everyone who arrives.
And I really loved the description. I was just leafing through my copy of the book there, because you obviously have the Levadia Palace where the conference itself took place, but each of the delegations kind of had its own separate headquarters for secure communications and all the rest of it. And I just really loved being a Brit and being the son of two Scots. I really loved the description of when the Churchills arrive at the Vorontsov Palace, and you talk about it was as if it was two completely different buildings: a Scottish nobleman's estate and Delhi's Jama Masjid Mosque. I just thought that was such a really just the location in Yalta, kind of east meeting west. I thought that was just a wonderful, wonderful description, and really kind of brought that scene to life. So for any listeners who haven't yet read the book, would thoroughly recommend it just for those kind of descriptions.
And then, of
But,
course, Stalin, with his choice of a home there, he takes the home of the man who was the mastermind behind the murder of Rasputin. So I think if he's trying to send a message, he does so very successfully.
Yeah, and I mean, even just the choice of location for the conference itself, the fact that it was a bit of a power play on his part to force, or to have Churchill and Roosevelt come to his own turf for the conference, and all of the difficulties that you described then with actually getting to the location. But this is really a humanizing book, I thought. I mean, the description of Churchill looking like I think you said looking like a tomato about to cry on the plane on the way over in the unpressurized cabin. I think it adds so much richness to our picture of Yalta, which is basically so often limited to that famous photo of the three leaders. So tell us about how you kind of brought out some of those more personal elements. What was the source material you used to actually learn about these more human moments? You know, we're so used in diplomatic history to looking at the government documents, the diplomatic cables, which is of course a part of this story too. But tell us about some of the more humanizing elements and what material allowed you to write in such detail about the real human side of these characters.
Yeah, so you mentioned the famous photograph of the big three sitting in the courtyard at Lavadia with their military advisors behind them. And it's really, I think, important to kind of mark that photo as the way that we think about the Yalta Conference and what it looked like. Because what's really interesting is that there's another photograph taken of the exact same scene, but from a very slightly different perspective, and it shows a completely different picture. You can see off to the side under the portico in this courtyard are the three daughters of Churchill, FDR, and Averell Harriman, who are there. And so it's that slight frame shift in perspective where you can see new people and new perspectives who are part of the conference. And in that contrast of the two photographs, it really made me think about, you know, these leaders, of all the people they could have chosen to come with them to this incredibly important conference on the precipice between World War and Cold War. They chose to bring their daughters. What does that say about their relationships with their daughters and the importance of them in their lives? And this is something that I think historians have really missed. And part of that is because of the availability of sources, which are different now than they used to be. But also kind of this idea of what would it have been like to have these great men of history who we put on a pedestal at these great summits, which are thought of these very impersonal, kind of distant aspects of history that I think a lot of people feel are unapproachable or difficult to understand, but they really aren't when you put it in a different lens. So what would it be like for these people just to be dad, which I thought was fascinating. And the way that this came about, I think because I found it in a very personal way, it kind of took on this personal side. I didn't set out to write a book about the Yalta Conference. I had studied history in undergrad and grad school and spent a lot of time working on Churchill kind of in earlier aspects of his life, not his time as prime minister. But then after finishing at Cambridge, I decided I should do kind of the smart thing, like many recent grads, and went to work in finance in New York. But coincidentally, in the lobby of my office was this bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which specializes in books by and about Winston Churchill. And I just couldn't believe this coincidence. So I used to go in there all the time when I'd say I needed coffee. I'd actually be sneaking down to the bookstore. And the owner introduced me to the International Churchill Society and Churchill family. And they were opening Sarah Churchill's papers to outside researchers for the first time and asked if I was interested in writing an article about them. And so in the process of writing this article about Sarah's archive, I realized what a fascinating life she'd had, especially during the war, where she did serve as a member of the women's branch of the Royal Air Force and also as her father's aide-de-camp at both Tehran and Yalta. And it was her value to her father at Tehran that inspired FDR and Harriman to then bring their daughters to the Yalta Conference. So the research kind of unfolded almost daughter by daughter, where I had this chance to see Sarah's archive and her remarkable papers. And then the Churchill family introduced me to Kathleen Harriman's family. And she had only passed away in 2011 and really never spoke about her experience during the war. She had served as a war reporter in London during the Blitz, while Averell Harriman was the Lend-Lease envoy, and they became very good friends with the Churchill family. And then she goes with him in 1943 when he becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union. And she learns to speak Russian and becomes the woman who has more access to Stalin's inner circle than any other American woman in history. And there's this huge box of letters that was just sitting in her apartment detailing this life that she'd had on the forefront of history, these beautiful letters, mostly to her sister and to her best friend, Pamela Churchill, Winston's daughter-in-law, where there's a bit of a scandal there between Kathleen's father and Pamela. And just these rich letters, you can see a young woman coming into her own. She's 27 at Yalta. And it just really puts a perspective of kind of like, being about that age. I was about Kathy's age when I started working on this, and and she was 27 at Yalta, Sarah was 30, and Anna was 38. And so to feel like, what would it be like to be my age and to be asked to get up and give a toast in front of Stalin in Russian, like, what would that be like?
One thing that's interesting based on what you just said is, what has your relationship been like with the families? Have you spoken to them were you speaking to them throughout the publication process, through the writing process? Obviously you needed the access to papers, and I think that really comes through in the book, how much access you had to a lot of personal papers. Were the families surprised by some of the things that you found? How was that relationship developed? Because that could be a tricky one for a historian sometimes with the families of their historical subjects.
Yes, these three families could not have been more generous and forthcoming and supportive, while also understanding the role of the historian and not looking to constrain the perspective in any way, really appreciating, yes, history there are many wonderful things about it, but also some things that perhaps we prefer not to talk about. And so just their understanding of that role of historian and their generosity with me was remarkable. And I'm so lucky to, have formed these friendships with these incredible people. And it's one of the greatest joys of writing this book. The Churchill family, as I mentioned, was just opening Sarah's archive, and they also allowed me access to Sarah's sister Mary's papers before they were open to outside researchers. The Kathleen Harriman's sons, the Mortimers, so kindly, allowed me to see all of these letters that Kathleen had written during the war, her scrapbooks, her appointment books, which are literally just sitting in a box and really need to be in an archive somewhere. And these had not been mined in this way. A handful of her letters had made their way into her father's papers in the Library of Congress, but not in any way that really revealed what a fascinating life she had led. And then I had the great fortune of meeting Anna Roosevelt's children through them, and her son and daughter in their 80s and 90s. And her daughter Ellie she was 18 at the time of Yalta, so has very clear memories of this time and of her mother during the war. And so it was this incredible opportunity to be at this inflection point of having new sources become available, but also having the family and friends of these women who loved them in this time still being with us, to be able to interview them and ask questions. And it was just a really special experience, getting to talk to people like Ellie Seagraves, Anna's daughter, Lady Jane Williams, who was Winston Churchill's secretary, who was very close to the family, and her son is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So she's had a really fascinating perspective on, the last number of decades. And so it was amazing to speak with the people who love the most, and it really does humanize it even further. Again, kind of, you think of Yalta and these great conferences as being very impersonal, but the political and the personal are intimately intertwined and cannot be separated. And I think that perspective on this conference is something that's very different and only possible because of the involvement and the generosity of the families in sharing these materials.
So here at ISD, we're obviously interested in what diplomats do, and you describe your three protagonists as daughter diplomats. So they're not official representatives of their countries, but they certainly play a crucial role in your telling at this conference, and even before the conference as well. They've played important roles in diplomacy, broadly interpreted. So just for our listeners, tell us a little bit about what are the daughters actually doing day to day at the conference? What is their role? How do their roles kind of overlap? But also, are there any kind of differences in the respective roles of the three daughters?
Yes. So daughter diplomats is exactly how I would describe it. They're there in the capacity where they're not speaking as official representatives of the government. They're not around the negotiating table with Stalin trying to hammer out the details for, post-war Germany or Poland. They don't have the security clearance to do that. That's not at all to say that they don't have influence and they don't have power if they're not at the table in the kind of traditional way that you would think of having power in foreign relations. But they're in this really unique position where they don't speak for their government, but they do speak with the weight of their fathers behind them. And so they can go and have conversations and deliver subtle messages and collect information for their fathers and kind of go in this ebb and flow where they can be very effective in this quasi-official capacity. That's kind of the role that all three of them occupy, but the specifics of it are for each of them are quite different. For Winston Churchill, his daughter Sarah, she had been an actress before the war, and so she has this ability to kind of act in these diplomatic settings where there's this intrigue that surrounds everything. And she also had been an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer in the WAFs, and so she has both the actress's deportment and also the technical knowledge of many of the Allied operations, especially the Mediterranean, which she had particularly worked on. And her father was very proud of her and her success in the military and would brag about her, sometimes even spilling the beans on some classified information. But she's really there to kind of be her father's conscience and counselor, kind of helping him take his frustration and anxiety about a deteriorating relationship with FDR, his concerns about a rising Soviet Union in the post-war world, and channel those frustrations and emotions in the most positive way before he goes into the conference room. And so that's Sarah's role. Kathleen is a more like a logistical kind of role. She speaks Russian, so she's acting as a go-between between the Soviets who are organizing the conference and the American delegation, and kind of extending her father's reach and influence. He leaves her to oversee the preparations for the conference while he flies off to Malta to meet with Churchill and FDR before the conference begins. And she's kind of serving in what I would say we think of today as a protocol officer's capacity at the State Department. And her language skills making this so valuable. And again, also in this kind of conscience and counselor role to her dad as well. And then Anna Roosevelt has really the most challenging role of any of the three daughters because she's carrying a heavy burden of a terrible secret, and it's the fact that her father is dying of congestive heart failure, and no one other than Anna and the cardiologist know how ill he is. Even FDR doesn't know. He never asks about his health. He has no idea how sick he is, but the fact that he brought Anna is a signal that he realizes something is wrong. Previously, he had brought his sons with him when he traveled abroad to help him physically, to stand and move. But he decides to, he cables Winston Churchill in February 1945 and says, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah again, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna. And so he clearly knows something is amiss, and Anna is trying to protect him. And so there's this unspoken relationship between them. And what's frustrating for Anna is that she's desperately trying to keep the secret and to keep her father alive, and doesn't know when she's going to have this chance to be with her father in this way, if ever again. But she's also kind of running interference and kind of serving as a gatekeeper for him, keeping people from meeting with him who she feels don't really need to meet with him. It will exhaust him, kind of under the guise of, even getting in the way of Churchill meeting with FDR, saying, oh, no, Stalin will think that we're ganging up on him if you guys meet together. But it's a bit unfair to put the blame on Anna for kind of the lack of these meetings between the two Western leaders, because FDR has political objectives too. And it's kind of allowing Anna to unwittingly carry them out on his behalf. And so the responsibility for the lack of, the kind of coordination between Churchill and Roosevelt, I do really think lies with FDR and not with Anna.
And I think there's so many angles to this that we could go into, but it really struck me in what you're saying there. And through the book itself, there is a huge amount of fragility at play in these three leaders. They need a lot of support emotionally and physically. And I'm just wondering, as you were writing the book, how did you think about sort of the concept of gender and how that was playing out in these in the story? I mean, it's not to impose some sort of 21st century analysis of gender and the daughters' roles onto this time period, but there was certain expectations about what their role could be or what it should be, and many of them confounded some of those expectations. But just I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of gender being such a kind of critical lens for analysis from historians today. How did that kind of factor into your work on these relationships and the daughter's role in kind of in many ways shepherding their fathers through this conference in very different ways.
Yeah, it's great to point out that it is a very 21st century perspective to have, thinking about it and framing it in that way, and really not one that the daughters would have had themselves while they were living through it. Some of the questions that we would ask today about, women's roles and different, ways of having power or the lack thereof are not things that would have occurred to them to ask or to think about in their own time. So when I started writing this story, I really thought of it in my head more of a story about the relationships between fathers and daughters rather than a feminist history of the Yalta Conference. It is telling the story through the eyes of the daughters, and it is as much a story about the relationships between fathers and daughters as it is about the Yalta Conference. I think for the daughters and their relationship with their fathers is almost a refreshingly modern kind of view that emerges from it. You don't really think of Winston Churchill as being this feminist, in a way, but he really valued the contributions and abilities of his wife and daughters immensely, and has great respect for them. Just has such pride in Sarah and her achievements in the military. And I really believe that if Sarah had been born 10 years later, she could have succeeded her father in politics. She had the demeanor for it, the intelligence, the incredibly astute perception of the political attitudes in Britain. And she was also just a beautiful writer. She really, her father's lyrical grasp of language comes through in her. And so I think in a different time, she could have been at the table. Averell Harriman also really surprisingly ahead of his time in involving his daughters in his work. He was never a warm and fuzzy father by any means, but he did invite his daughters to participate in and kind of work alongside him in his career in a way that fathers of that era and that class really didn't. And so it's his idea to bring Kathleen with him when he becomes the Lend-Lease envoy in London, and to encourage her to work as a war reporter, even though the Blitz is on, it's pretty dangerous, but he sees this will be a remarkable opportunity for her to have at 23 years old, and is not in any way pushing her to stay home, get married. That's just not kind of in his frame of reference, and really values her. And their relationship is almost more like colleagues or business partners than father and daughter, which is really interesting. The thing that most surprised me was that you think of FDR and the Roosevelts as being incredibly progressive, and in so many ways in domestic politics, they absolutely were. But there was a little bit of a double standard when it came to the relationships within their family. For years, Anna had been begging to come with her father on one of his overseas meetings. He always brought his sons and was very reluctant to bring either his wife Eleanor or Anna. And there's a lot of frustration that Anna has that she expresses to her mother in the period before Yalta, where she's saying that, father kind of expects the women in his life just to, sit home and tend the fire, essentially, which is not the view that you think that you're going to have of FDR. And so I think that it just goes to show that all of these figures are significantly more nuanced than we think. Their public attitudes and actions aren't necessarily indicative of their private ones, and that lens into the private world is something that we really can only see through a figure like one of these daughters. And it does make it a much more human and personal and complex story than we previously had imagined.
Absolutely, and again, that human side, I think, comes through so nicely through that particular lens. One final question, because of course, talking about the Yalta Conference through the three daughters that you choose, it kind of leaves Stalin out on the side a little bit. So where's his daughter? Where's his confidant in all of this?
Yes, his daughter Svetlana is 19 years old, and unlike these other three men and their daughters, Stalin and Svetlana had a very bad relationship. Svetlana learns as a teenager that her mother had committed suicide and was really driven to it by Stalin and his cruelty. And from there on out, they have a very challenging relationship, to say the least. She as a teenager, falls in love with and has an affair with an older married man who is Jewish and a filmmaker, and Stalin objects to this and sends him off to Siberia. And then Svetlana rebels and marries one of her classmates just at 19 years old, who is also Jewish, and Stalin takes exception to this as well and refuses to ever meet his son-in-law. And so this is kind of the state of affairs between them. She's pregnant with her first child at the time of Yalta, but she did speak English and could have been very useful to her father like these other daughters were. And on occasion, even though Stalin really didn't like to have her interact with foreigners, he does use her to further his objectives. On one meeting that Churchill and Stalin had when Churchill comes to Moscow, Stalin brings his daughter out at dinner one night, almost as if to say, look, I'm a family man too. It's this odd kind of, stilted overture to making Stalin seem more human, which is very uncomfortable. And Stalin and his daughter would go on to have a very challenged relationship, and she would later defect from the Soviet Union and move to the United States, but always kind of trying to outrun this legacy of who her father was and her place in the world, which it's quite tragic. So Svetlana is not there, that she is there in a sense and spirit. At one point, she had sent a brooch to Sarah Churchill as kind of daughter-to-daughter diplomacy, and Sarah wears this throughout the conference. So there is a gesture to Svetlana at the conference.
Well, on that note, Catherine Katz, thank you for this really wonderful book, this entwined history of these families. It was a great read, something I enjoyed reading as kind of a break from the news cycle, if nothing else. So thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Check out the links in our show notes to find Catherine Katz's book, and to register for ISD's joint event on Disinformation with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which will take place on December 1st. Follow us on Twitter at GU Diplomacy, and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu. Have a safe and restful Thanksgiving. We look forward to bringing you more content next week.